Welcome back, guys, to the JPS Education Portal podcast, and I am here with Lyle McDonald. Lyle, welcome.
Howdy, thanks for having me.
Our pleasure, man. And today we're going to be talking about gender differences when it comes to resistance training, fat loss, muscle growth, and everything else in between. So for those of you who don't know, Lyle has written a book on female-specific training and nutrition recommendations.
Yeah, just
yes.
Nutrition so far. The training
Okay.
book had to be split out because otherwise it was going to be like 600 pages long. But
yeah, perfect. And Lyle's the man to talk on this topic with. So Lyle, talk to us. What are some of, I guess, the main sex differences when it comes to resistance training that most people would be better off knowing about?
So I think, well, just sort of as some background, one of the things to really realize is that with women, there are a huge number of situations that you may be sort of dealing with is the wrong phrase, because that sounds like it's a problem that needs to be dealt with, but that are a concern. So the big one under a lot of conditions is the menstrual cycle, right? That's the roughly 4-week cycle where hormones are changing drastically, mood may be changing, appetite may be changing, some coordination can changing, injury risk can be changing. And that is sort of a primary concern. But then that can get modified. In my big book, I called these hormonal modifiers. Then you got the whole aspect of birth control, which is brutally complicated. It nearly gave me a nervous breakdown trying to figure it out, because you've got oral birth control, the patch, the pill, the injection, the hormonal IUD. You've got ones that have only synthetic progesterone, one of the primary female hormones. You've got some that most have both. Oral comes in all kinds. There's different types. It's really complicated. Let's just put it that way. So that can modify the situation. Women can lose their menstrual cycle for a number of reasons. Frequently women who are kind of over exercising and they're under eating relative to their activity can have menstrual cycle dysfunction, and that affects hormones. You've got polycystic ovary syndrome, which is the most commonly found reproductive dysfunction in women, and that can manifest in a number of ways. Frequently, it shows up. You typically see elevated androgen levels, testosterone levels, and that actually it causes a lot of health problems. But it also increases trainability. Like even some women PCOS to the extremes can have like double the normal testosterone levels of women, and they gain muscle much more easily. They gain strength much more easily. You tend to see that they're overrepresented in elite sport, like at the Olympics. Like in general population, 10 to 20%, depending on who you read. And like the Olympics, 30 to 35%, because it gives a physical advantage. And that's just premenopause, right? Then when you get into all the hormonal changes that occur later in a woman's life, you've got early perimenopause, which is when the system starts to get a little bit funky, late perimenopause, and then menopause with either hormone replacement or not, right? Whereas men, it's testosterone. You will see differences, obviously. A man with higher testosterone will be more trainable than a man with lower testosterone, and levels do sort of decline over the lifespan, and that's it, right? So getting back to the menstrual cycle, you see these huge variations in hormone levels, and some women experience huge variations in performance in terms of their strength, their coordination, and others don't at all, right? Whereas a guy, he's the same dude every day in the gym, right? He may be tired from Monday, but it's not like because of this massive hormonal shift, his entire physiology has changed. So that's part of it. And I think both for coaches and also for female trainees, it's important to realize that. Now, I live in America where we're crazed. And anybody listening to this, if you're not in the US, if I tend to use a lot of very careful language, it's because in this country, if you say the wrong thing about women or men, or women are this and men are this, you get really a lot of feedback. But the fourth week of a woman's menstrual cycle, that's the week where typically PMS or premenstrual syndrome or premenstrual tension, depending on what part of the world you're in, or even premenstrual dysphoric disorder can happen. And many women will experience huge mood changes, lack of energy, their strength may fall. I had one trainee, this was many years ago, and I was a dumb dude. This is before I looked into all this. And she'd come in some weeks and just PRs. And she'd come in that one week and like couldn't lift the bar. And I'm, like I said, I'm a dumb dude. And I was just like, what's the problem? Just pick up the damn bar. And she couldn't like physically. And when I finally started to notice things, I saw this pattern with her where it was like week one, right after ovulation, strong, PRs, great training. Week two, down a little bit, ovulations in the middle. Week three would come back up. And then week four, I was like, we're going to goof off on machines at 60%. She didn't have the coordination for squats, anything complex. So I adapted her training to her performance once I figured it out. And like literally that final week of the cycle, nothing. She'd start her cycle, she'd start menstruating. 2 days later, PR'd everything. So I just set it up like that. And again, some women will be sort of a flat line. But what I hear happening is either, again, coaches who aren't aware of this tend to very much, woman comes in, coordination's down, strength is down, performance is down. And since we don't deal with that, we just go, what's the problem? Do the work, just what I don't like that. If you're that type of coach, which I know you're not, that type of, get it together. But as a female trainee, it's important to realize this, because if you're a motivated trainee, which I absolutely get, and you come in and you just can't do the training because you're in a part of your cycle where your performance is down, it's very easy for women, you get that psychology of they internalize it of, well, I should just be able to suck it up and do it. It's like, and I brought up the America thing because in this country now there's this attitude that, the idea that women have this happen on PMS is an idea created by the patriarchy to blah, 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 blah. And I'm not getting into the politics of it. This is a physiology. Some women are, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which happens in a small percentage. I mean, this is the women that are incapacitated by cramps, that may be dealing with massive mood issues. If they're prone to depression, they may be prone to suicidal idea. Like that's at the extremes. And then PMS, it can be worse. And then some women are, and you frequently find women who don't have that happen go, what's the problem? And then, of course, we have no clue because we've never experienced it. So, but for women that experience that, and you have to really, I can give generalities, right? In general, first week of the cycle tends to be the strongest. Second week, a little bit weaker. Ovulation, there's this little spike in testosterone. Performance is usually better. And then usually if there's a week that's going to be the worst, it's typically week 4. Now, I can speak in generalities, but women or their coaches are ultimately going to be your best scientists. And there was a paper several years ago, and I think it was in adolescent female soccer players. What they did is they gave them the same workout for a month, and they had them record rating of perceived exertion and heart rate and sleep and mood and all of that so that they could establish those patterns. And if you simply see that, yeah, look, in week 4, it's not going to happen, you have to, whatever, you change the training. You go, if the max strength isn't there, if you're trying to do heavy loading, go do some circuit stuff, go do some high rep stuff, go play on machines, go do something else. And then when you swing back into week 1 and you're strong, and there's been limited research that women may get better adaptations in the first half of the cycle versus the second. I mean, it's relative terms. It's not like you don't get any in the second half, so there's some logic to maybe clustering training in the first half, in the first 2 weeks. And they, but again, it's a matter of seeing the pattern. Some of it else depends on the kind of training, right? Like if you're doing more traditional, bodybuilding or physique training, 12 to 15 reps, even 10 to 12, stuff like that. I don't find that those performance changes are that different, right? Like let's say from week 1 to week 4, your maximum strength is down 10%, just to throw a number out. You can still grind out the reps, right? Okay, what was 75% is now 80. You can get the reps. Now, if you're a strength power athlete, if you're a female power lifter, Olympic lifter, you do strong man, woman, person competition. I don't know what it's being called anymore. And you're supposed to do, 90% of your max for doubles, and your maximal strength is down 10% or more, you physically can't do that workout. And it can be very demoralizing. And once you establish that pattern, then you just start adapting the training to that. Like, all right, we know you're strong, I'm going to hammer you. When I know that it's not going to be there, we're going to. So you end up figuring out when to deload, sort of based on menstrual cycle dynamics. Now, again, when you put in birth control, that changes the game. And some female athletes will actually use birth control to flatten that out, because it flattens the hormones out more, right? Because if you're a high performance athlete, you can't really afford to lose 1 week out of 4, right? That's 12 weeks out of the year that your training is not going well. So that's kind of a big one that like I said, as dude coaches, we don't tend to, or if we do notice it, we just go, it's a problem, suck it up.
Yeah.
And then female trainees get very disappointed in themselves. They're like, I should be able to go hammer myself. Like, maybe not. So
Yeah. So auto-regulating training is hugely important for females who do experience those larger fluctuations in performance
sure,
across the month.
absolutely. And I know coaches that will say, well, fundamentally, is that any different from how you would train a male, right? A lot of people just will say, especially if they take an auto-regulation approach, will go, look, it's no different in the sense of I'm still going to auto-regulate training. I simply think that the variations you may potentially see, yeah, fine, whatever. A dude is 5% up, plus or minus any given day. But there are other changes than just that. There are frequently changes in coordination in that, after ovulation, there is, because of estrogen's effects on ligaments, there can be a slightly increased risk of certain types of injuries. Now, this is more, you see this in sports performance, soccer, football, what the rest of the world calls it, where you're tending to see a lot of ACL ruptures. Weight room stuff, not so much. Like I said, with my one trainee, I had her doing deadlifts and I think even some power cleans. And that 4th week wasn't even about lowering the load. It was about, this is physically impossible for her. So you start to see, I think, whereas a guy, yeah, you come in and you just do 65% because the strength isn't there. And a female, you might have to drop it out and just do completely different training. And in some extreme cases, it might be like, look, you should just go home. If a woman is truly incapacitated, like I said, by cramps or by the mood stuff, maybe just like, all right, come in and goof off, or maybe just stay at home.
Yeah, cool. And besides the menstrual cycle, what are some of the other, I guess, physiological differences that may impact training or that should be taken into consideration?
Well, I think there's both physiological issues and then there's some really important practical issues that often very much get forgotten. Physiologically, so if you look at like absolute strength for women's lower body versus men's lower body, it's about 60 to 80%. So in general, women will be about 60 to, this is making a lot of assumptions, and I'll come back to that. And for upper body, it's closer to 40 to 60% of that's looking at untrained. That's where that's with none of that. Now it's typically said that, because this gets into a whole big issue of determining difference between women and men, and I don't want to get into the weeds on this, but like, how are you normalizing it, right? If you take a man and a woman of the same body weight, do you normalize it by how much muscle mass they have, right? Women have on average 10 to 11% more body fat. Is the reason they can't lift as much at a given weight a physiological difference in their muscles? Is it because there's a big, trying to figure out how to, like I said, to normalize this and even compare is very difficult, right? But when you start to look at women's muscles in general, it is more or less identical to a man's, right? Like if you put a woman's cardiac muscle from her heart on a microscope, and it wouldn't look that different. There's some minor differences. So in that sense, so it's like the difference is women have less of it. However, there's other research that's starting to come out that's saying like even when you equate it for muscle mass, women typically are a little bit weaker. There's something else you will see per unit muscle. Because even at the highest levels of sport, at elite levels of sport, on average, women are about 10 to 11% behind men. And that's been pretty standard since the 80s, right? Like it was before that, it was way different because women didn't have access to sport and weren't allowed to do it. That value has really been pretty static, and that's a biological difference. And it depends on the sport. Swimming, which is non-body weight, not a body weight thing. Ice speed skating, of all things, track cycling is more like 7%. When you get into upper body dominant stuff, kayaking, pole vault, shot put, it's closer to 25% because, again, of the lower upper body muscle mass. So in a sense, there is that the muscle's not that different. And you will see frequently it claimed that women have more slow twitch muscle fibers than men. And that is true on average, but except for the studies that show the opposite. And there was a study recently by Andy Galpane, who does a lot of good work on this. And in elite female power athletes, elite Olympic lifters, women actually had slightly more of the fast twitch fibers. So when we start to look at averages, again, it's like, yeah, in general, women may show, a little bit better endurance in terms of a certain, if you put them in a certain percentage, they may get more reps on some exercises, except when they don't. That, again, tends to be very individual, and it's hard to generalize. I think there's a tendency, like in that, the study of female Olympic lifters, well, that's interesting, but who's going to reach the elite level of Olympic lifting? It's the people that genetically have that to begin with, right? There's very much a selection bias. Those women go into that sport, succeed at it, and continue at it. And the women who go into it and don't have the muscle fiber type or the physiology or the psychology don't tend to continue. So you've got that issue. I think, but you've also got some biomechanical issues that often don't get factored in. Women, again, there's more. Again, I will speak in generalities. Women typically have wider hips than men, narrower shoulders. This frequently shows up in certain activities, with squats and knees breaking in, and running. What you typically see with good female runners or the elite level female runners, they tend to have a very narrow hips, more of a quote unquote masculine body type, because with wide hips it changes the biomechanics. Whatever the Q angle and all that stuff they used to talk about, and that gets into, I think, some practical issues of women's muscular distribution tends to be very different than that. Men's tends to be more even, half and half, whereas women's tends to be typically lower body dominant. So frequently what a woman's legs can move is much more than what her upper body can handle, right? You see this in, say, back squatting or front squatting. Woman's leg strength can move a lot more than she can probably comfortably hold on her shoulders. And this is part of why you see these differences in sports performance. When you get into the upper body dominant sports, women's upper bodies are far more limiting. You see this in Olympic lifting, where the differences in performance are much greater because the snatch and the clean and jerk both are part of the upper body overhead. I did a very informal analysis of female powerlifting, and I tried to look at the same weight classes best as I could. I used, non-geared, I used drug tested to take all those variables out. And on average, women were more like 20% because all three lifts to one degree or another use the upper body. So you've got that issue that many exercises that might be appropriate may not be appropriate for women. I think that's why, the hip thrust, whether we don't have to get into, I think part of the reason that was so beneficial for women as an exercise, because prior to that, it was like, just do full squats for glutes. Well, that's great if you can actually hold the bar on your shoulders, if you got not only the upper body strength, but, the meat and the traps to not have a bar digging into your back. Go to the hip thrust, you take that component out, you isolate it to that specific muscle group without that limiting factor. So I think you've got that aspect. Let me go back to the physiology for a second. One thing you do see, women don't generate as much fatigue as men. I'm sure you've seen that with your trainees, right? Give a woman a set of like 15 in the back squat or 15 in the leg press or some high rep leg work. 30 seconds later, she's ready to go. Give that same set to a dude, and he's going to have to go lay down for a few minutes. And there's a number of reasons. It may be related to fiber type. Some of it is related to the absolute workload, right? And this is the problem. If you're comparing a female squatting 100 kilos, 225 pounds, to a male squatting 150 kilos, 330 pounds, the woman doesn't generate as much fatigue. Now, if you compare a woman squatting 100 kilos to a man squatting 100 kilos, the differences may not be as profound. So it depends. There's this big normalization. Like I said, that's a big scientific kerfuffle right now, figuring out how to do all that. But also, women love to train lower body in the same way that men love to train upper body, by and large. And there's genetic factors, there's cultural factors, there's appearance factors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it just in the same way, it can be tough to get men training legs hard because it hurts more and they don't care about those muscle groups. Frequently getting women to work as hard on upper body, and they just won't make the same gains. You see this in powerlifting a lot, where women will have big squats, big deadlifts, and you look at their bench press, and comparatively speaking, it's just, and they can toil and toil and toil, and it's just the numbers just aren't there. But getting back to practical things, you even run into this, and this is something people forget about in terms of like some machines, some exercises, right? A chest supported row or a T-bar row where a man might not have any problem with that. And with women, you have the issue of breasts, which again, there's huge variability in terms of that, but that exercise may be unbearably uncomfortable for some women to do. And you may have to make, slight exercise modifications. I don't want anybody to think of like, oh, there's women's exercises and there's men's exercise. That's a whole bunch of old school, that's like, well, there's bulk exercises and toning exercises, and that's just gibberish. But there are practical components. I actually wrote a chapter about this in the unfinished second half that also doesn't get thought of. I mean, you've got the breast tissue, which can change center of gravity. It can change biomechanics. It can change, barbell bench press, where you're actually bringing a bar down, may be very uncomfortable, whereas a dumbbell bench press may not. Hell, you've got the implant issue. Implants above and below the pec do very different things for that musculature. We might even ask, I've got a trainee and she has implants, or someone I consulted with. She's like, why should I care about chest work? You can't see my pecs. It's like, a good point. So you've got that can change biomechanics. You can see, you've got the hair issue, where again, on average, women will frequently wear their hair longer, ponytails. At powerlifting meets, it's actually, women will often, mine did, Sumi, my elite powerlifter, she would change how she wore her hair for different lifts. Because trust me, it only takes once to get a ponytail caught under a squat bar to learn a very hard lesson about that. Whereas if a woman's bench pressing, a ponytail will mess with her head. So there's a lot of practical factors like that, in terms of it may alter the exercise selection that may be done. Another one is that tends to get forgotten is grip. You see this macho thing, straps are for babies, that whole macho nonsense. And it's like, well, a lot of elite athletes use straps because it would be dumb to let your grip limit your back work or your deadlift assistance work and stuff like that. But women tend to have smaller wrists. Interestingly, for reasons I'm not aware of, with their forearms, even if you normalize for muscle mass, they are still weaker in general. So for high rep grip exercises, many women, their hands may be too small to grip many bars, right? In Olympic lifting, women actually use a narrower bar for that reason. Powerlifting has not made that adjustment for reasons I don't know. I've never, somebody should, because even again, my lifter, she had what she described as toddler hands. And we went to a meet that used an extra thick, heavy squat bar, and her hands barely fit around it. So for her, in that case, straps may be more of a required type of thing for pulling movements. So again, you don't want to let your grip limit what you're actually trying to train. You could get into high heels chronic high heel use can actually shorten the Achilles tendon. and the calves, which can affect. But women tend to be more mobile than men. I don't generally find that flexibility is an issue, and I don't know if in the modern era if women wear heels 8 to 5 days a week, but that can cause there are all these practical considerations that may impact exercise choice. I think there's also a frequently left out psychological factor in training in terms of what women want to do in the gym. And I'm not saying, obviously as coaches and trainers, I'm not saying, just let them, there was a very famous celebrity trainer here who said women should never lift more than 1.5 kilos because they would get bulky. It's like, your baby weighs more than that. But I'm not saying that type of stuff. But there was a movement in the 2000s where a lot of women who I guarantee you had polycystic ovary syndrome, because there tends to be a certain personality profile, were like, every woman should be doing heavy power lifts. Well, no, that's dumb. Powerlifting is a great sport. I love it. Many women are not cut out for it biomechanically. They've got wide hips. And also psychologically. I mean, I've never met a dude, unless they were much older, who didn't want to push heavy weights. Have you? No, exactly. That's just part of the male psychology. Again, until you're like 70, you don't care anymore. I'm 54 and I know better. And my brain in the weight room is still like, just add 5 more pounds. But I break now. So I've gotten, not all women are wired for that psychologically, biomechanically. Now, if women are great, and I realize sometimes it's women are afraid of lifting heavy, don't want to get bulky, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even if they do, and realize that doesn't happen and like getting stronger, that doesn't mean that they need to be doing triples or fives in a back squat or a deadlift. They may not have the drive to do that. And I'm not saying it's good or bad. Truly, I'm not. They may be better off in a higher repetition range. So long as they're working hard, it accomplishes the same thing, as we all know. And I tend to find, again, there's a selection process to a degree. A woman with PCOS who has double the normal testosterone levels is most likely not going to be drawn to doing, like a physique competition and putting on, the glittery bathing suit and the hooker heels or the stripper heels. Whereas a woman who's drawn to that, more likely than not, probably not going to be drawn to pushing, to deadlifting triples. So, like, again, I'm speaking in generalities. There's always exceptions. I realize there's a lot more crossover. Women's powerlifting is, but that's just a practical thing. Is it's frequently, and again, yes, this is, you got to work with the male psychology as well. But dudes always want to go heavier. That's just how it is. The only other thing I would add, and then we can move on in terms, again, this is a practical issue, and especially for upper body, is that frequently, because the poundages or the kiloages, is that a word? Whatever.
I don't think that's a word, but yeah, the tonnage.
Whatever commie units y'all use over there.
Kilos.
Whatever. The kilos, like the amount that's being lifted in absolute terms is typically so much lower that frequently the smallest weight jump you may have access to is staggeringly large. Right. So if you're a guy and you're benching, say, call it, 100 kilos, 220 pounds, you can add 2.5 kilos to each side. And that's 5%.
Yeah.
And if you've got a female that's benching 25 kilos, like, it's not unheard of for women, or even 50 kilos. And you put that same weight on, you've now added 10%. And that would be like putting, you wouldn't add 10 kilos to a man's bench workout to workout.
And I think that also ties in with what you were saying earlier about some of those practical issues that might lead to women being less inclined to have that same mentality as a male, where, yeah, let's add, 5 pounds or add 5 kilos, because they literally can't for weeks and weeks and sometimes months, because their rate of adaptation to match the fixed load increments of whatever weights, that would certainly play into that as well.
Because when you actually look at the research, and again, this is beginners, right? And and we can sort of touch on this. In terms of relative progress, beginners both men and women make about the same. Like they both add whatever 20% over 6 months to their starting poundages. It's just a woman's starting poundage is, half or less of a man's. In some work, women actually make slightly better gains in upper body, but that's because they're starting from a lower baseline. And there's probably cultural issues here where typically it's changing. It's interesting. A lot of this research is from decades ago. And I do wonder, like, if they redid it now that society and culture has changed, because back in the day, back when I grew up, in the 80s and the 70s, if you were a boy, I mean, we didn't have the internet, you played sports. So males automatically got exposure to certain activities that girls and women just didn't. And that's changed somewhat, but still, that's typically what you see. But again, we're talking in relative terms. But yeah, you have to often get extremely creative with women's more upper body. I mean, there are cases like it would be rare for a woman to come in. Like, let's say you were going to be doing, the big compound movements. It would be rare for a woman who wasn't much older to not be able to squat a 20-kilo bar. That would be very, very, very uncommon. I'm sure it happens, but on average, whereas a man can come in and put weight on. I have seen it, and you've probably seen it too. Trying to do barbell bench press, for many women, a 20-kilo bar is too heavy. Like the lightest bar, if that's all you've got, may be far above what she is initially capable of. And you may have to, if your gym has, we've got like fixed barbells with weights on the end, you may have to start with 10 kilos. Typically, when I was training, beginner women, since I didn't typically teach barbell bench press, it was on a machine, the lightest weight possible, and hope for the best. And usually or I'd teach them a dumbbell press, and literally they might start with 2.5 kilos the first day per hand. And I mean, you work up, obviously, but even then, that next jump from 2.5 kilos, if you're lucky, you have 3.5, you have 5 to 8 pounds. Frequently, it's 5 to 10. Okay, you've just doubled the weight. And then it's typically in the US, it's 10 to 12 pounds, which is 4.5 kilos to 5.5, thereabouts. And that's getting there. And then the next up from there is 12 to 15. So it's 6.5 to like the jump. And then it's from 15 to 20. From that point on, it's 2.5 kilos per hand. And it's not like a lateral raise or overhead press or a lot of arm movements. Forget it. You will go from like 12 perfect reps and you add weight, 0. And
and this is where I think some powerlifting gyms, I know that we have this specific equipment available here, but micro plates, right? So we can add 500 grams instead of a kilo. Absolutely. And things like that, and all these other gadgets that you can add on to your dumbbells or plates are super handy for female trainees.
Oh yeah. And many women, it's almost going to be mandatory. So, they've got magnet plates, which tend to be expensive and heavy and often fall off. You've got, if you've got using a barbell, you can get like micro plates that are, 500 grams. And, I use those extensively with, even with, when my elite female powerlifter, I mean, she was benching, what's 185 pounds, 82.5, something. Even then, when she was at her max, I would add, 1.5 pounds, 3/4 of a kilo to each side of the bar to keep her progressing. And with her daughter, who was, benching for 35 kilos, I might have to add even less than that. So you've got those. I've seen a new device now. It's this little sort of round clippy thing, and it sort of snaps on the inside. They're unfortunately very expensive. I think it's an interesting toy. We would get creative. I would use wrist weights for certain, when they were, effective, when they were doing something where gravity pointed down, so I could add 0.5 kilo per hand and things of that nature. Because again, lateral
raises. Like on a lateral raise or something like that.
Right, like or even on overhead press, gravity's pointing down, so you can do that, or a lateral raise, and it's giving a little bit of extra resistance down there, and you build up. It may be 0.5 kilo every couple of weeks,
and that's where I think in terms of the progression strategy that you apply with women, depending on the exercise specifically, you've got to be a little bit less load centric with how you
Yes.
conceptualize progression. You have to focus on other things such as rep progression, potentially even
Yep.
set progression, like your double and triple progressions, even things
I
like
agree.
density and stuff like that.
Yep. And I absolutely agree, because as much as I am a proponent of progressive tension overload and adding weight, again, that's an over time thing. But you may, to your point, you may be using a very different progression. One thing that I recommend when I do consultations, more often to women than to men, it's like, look, again, that lateral raise, that 4.5 to 5.5 kilo, it's a huge jump. And I'm like, all right, we've got you doing 4 sets of 12, whatever it is, right? I know if I add weight, it's going to just turn into, they might get one, probably not even that. And if they do, it'll be horrible. I'm like, all right, I'm going to have you build up to 4 sets of 15. Because if you can do that much, you can probably do one decent set the next weight of maybe 5 to 6. Like, you won't get the rep range, and that's fine. But like, at some point, they have to touch the weight. And you do that. And then what I tell them is, like, you can either immediately drop back to the lighter weight and finish the set, or you stop, and then you're going to do the next 3 sets at the previous weight, right? To keep getting. And then that first set, you're going to build it up to 12, and then you're going to do the second set at the heavier weight. And maybe it's the same. Maybe you only get 5 or 6. Maybe now that you've done it, maybe you get 12, and then every workout, we're going to, and then once you get to 4 sets of 12, well, now we got to build you up to 4 sets of 15 again. And exactly what you're saying. Of course, to that, add the potential menstrual cycle changes. If you've observed those, right? Like, you may not even be able to get that on a week-to-week basis. You may be realistically, depending on the trainee, only able to get possibly an improvement once a month. And it can be exhaustingly slow. I mean, really, really exhaustingly slow under the best of conditions. And if you've got the other difficulties, it can be an even. So yeah, absolutely. You need to be more flexible with your progressions and what you do and things of that nature. So
Awesome, awesome. And in terms of, I guess, before we start to round out the conversation, your practical advice from a coaching sense, because a lot of our audience for this podcast will be coaches. What are some of the big, I guess, metrics that you're monitoring with your female trainees, to better understand their performance fluctuations over the menstrual cycle? Obviously, their actual performance itself being one, but how do you sort of track and gauge some of these things so that you can better individualize training?
I would certainly be looking at things like, I mean, if they're good at reporting rating of perceived exertion, which some are and some aren't, that would be one to do it. Like, if some trainees are really good at knowing reps in reserve, and others are terrible at it. My lifter happened to be terrible at it. Her perceived exertion was easy, hard. There was just, once it got up, it was all hard and it was all slow, and she was terrible at it. So I had to watch as a coach and watch rep speed, right? So like I said, what you might do is, just for the first month, just give them the same workout, whatever it is, and just watch. See, is there endurance between, are they needing longer between sets, which can happen because cumulative fatigue is higher or their energy levels are lower? Are you seeing, okay, during the first week of the cycle, that 4th set of 15, went up, all reps were pretty fast. And on this one, grinding it out to get the reps, things of that nature. Which again is the same thing you would kind of observe in a male trainee, but you may be seeing large fluctuations, and you may be seeing no fluctuations, and that can kind of inform the training. I mean, if you want to get deep into it, you could, I guess you could ask them about mood, because that can be variable over the cycle. I will just put it, they typically week 4, if there's going to be a problem, that's typically when it's going to occur. And what the research, the way they put it politely, is that women may become more emotionally labile during that phase of the cycle, meaning that their mood may be worse. I had a nurse practitioner, and some of her female patients, they would have to add an extra antidepressant in the 4th week of the cycle. Like, it can be that severe. And then I knew a therapist, and same thing. And I mean, he was being a little bit facetious, but he was like, with with a male trainee, with a male client, I always know what I'm getting. But with a female, it's like, okay, who am I working with today? And if 5 minutes into the session, they're bawling their eyes out, I'm like, okay, I kind of know what's going on. And this is really just getting into the psychology of it. And I don't know how prevalent this is now, and I doubt it you or your coaches or hopefully the people listening to it. You often find that motivating men and women is a very different type of thing. Again, men are inherently a little bit more aggressive. They want to go heavy. Again, I know I'm speaking in gross generalities. There are women that have that aggression too. They're the ones that want to be power lifters. I've had trainees that I would just bang heads with. But many of the old school ideas or the ways that male coaches motivated male athletes, which was typically by challenging their manhood. I'm sure that was a thing in Australia, at least in like rugby. Here in American football, it's just a matter of, you want to motivate a male trainee, you call him a girl. And that tends to not work real well with the average female trainee. So, some people respond to rah-rah types of stuff. And I know others that, if you start shouting and berating and trying to get them psyched up when it's not there, that is not going to go very well. So so like you may, ask them about their mood. Also, sleep can change very much over the menstrual cycle. Again, typically when things get bad, it's that 4th week of the cycle. That can change. Appetite can change. So these are all things that would not only give you information, but would also give you a rough idea of when certain parts of the cycle are happening in terms of what you're seeing. And there are apps now. There's one called, I think it's Fitter Woman. Let me hang on. I looked this up just recently for someone. It's the fitterwoman.com app. And actually it's got, I think what it does is that it lets women enter all this information in an attempt to sort of track what they're doing for whatever reason in terms of, body temperature, mood, or coordination, or good God, that's what I'm looking for. Just excitement for trying, just all of those things, which again, we would do with male trainees, but unless you're just beating on them, unless you're just doing, those shock cycles where you're grinding them in the dust, you just don't see that variation. So just spend a month, give them the same workout. You can observe what happens, get them to report what they're feeling, look at rest intervals, even look at how they're recovering. You may find in the first 2 weeks of the cycle that workout to workout, they recover very well. In the second half of the cycle, not so much.
I've found tracking soreness to be a very, very useful metric as well.
Yeah, that's actually a good point, because again, in the first half of the cycle, where primarily estrogen is the dominant hormone, it's funny, it's gotten the reputation as being the bad woman's hormone, but if anything, it's the good one. And realize both are important, good and bad are done, but in the sense of fat loss, trainability, those things, estrogen is the good hormone, and it tends to decrease appetite, increase fat oxidation, but it also is anti-inflammatory. So women typically don't get sore in the first half of the cycle. In the second half of the cycle, progesterone after ovulation goes up and becomes sort of the more dominant hormone. It tends to, it not only has its own negative effects, but it blocks the effects of estrogen. So it's kind of so you see more inflammation, you see a little bit more protein breakdown. Even though energy expenditure is up, appetite is often up, cravings tend to go up. It also directly promotes fat storage. Like progesterone is in this context, the bad. So first half of the cycle, that makes perfect sense to me, in terms of just what they're reporting.
Awesome, man.
Like well, I think if they come into the gym and they're just like, there's no motivation there, like they're just like, oh my God, they're dragging themselves out of bed, out of work. Don't even wait. Just like proactively go, we're going to deload and do something else that still makes you feel like you accomplished something.
Yeah, exactly right.
I think that's what happens. Like, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think you've given listeners plenty to think about. And I totally agree. I think motivation is a big one to monitor as well. But at the same time, you have to be careful with that, because if some people are wired in a way where if you give them an inch, they can take a mile, and they lose. Absolutely. yeah, they lose the ability to sort of push and train hard despite not feeling great. And then anytime they don't feel their best, they're just looking for that deload or lighter session.
Oh,
So
I agree entirely. And you see, I mean, you see that in all trainees, and there's sort of an old adage that if you're coaching athletes, you typically have to hold them back. And if you're training the general population, again, this isn't meant to be critical. This isn't meant, you frequently have to push them a little. That is the danger of auto-regulation. Oh, if you're not feeling good, make it a light workout. Well, some people will point out, rightfully so, your body lies to you. Some of the best workouts I've personally ever had was when I walked into the gym and was like, oh God, I don't want to be, and I would warm up. And I even told my own coach when I was an athlete, I said, if I ever come in here excited about training, it's going to be a trash workout.
yeah,
And if I come in because I'm relaxed, and if I come in half asleep, and even then, what I would always tell people, go look, even if you feel terrible walking to the gym, do your warm-ups, and frequently it will click in, and you'll feel great. And if you do your warm-ups or your first work set and you still feel like trash, then you can make that decision. But I absolutely agree with you. And getting back to the PMS thing, again, part of the extremism in the US, it's become this, because there's such a pushback against some of these old ideas about the menstrual cycle. It's like, oh, some women are just using PMS as an excuse, to be the B word or whatever it is. And like, I'm not saying that can't be the case, but to speak in absolutes is just as bad as saying, oh yeah, when women have PMS, they're crazy. It's
yeah.
like, it can and it can't, and it depends. And that's part of, learning your individual athlete. And yeah, if you've got the person who tends to quit easy or quit early whenever they have an excuse, yeah, no, I agree completely.
Yeah. Well, Lyle, thank you very much for your time, man. I think, yeah, people are going to take a lot of value from that. I always love hearing you discuss these topics. You're a wealth of knowledge. Where can people find you to learn more?
So my website is and has always been since forever, bodyrecomposition.com, all one word. You can get to my store, store.bodyrecomposition.com. And all my books are there, including the woman's tome. And make no mistake, it is a tome. It's 325 pages of dense text, and volume 1 only deals with nutrition and fat loss, but it talks about all this physiology. And actually, there's one other thought I want to make before we wrap up after I finish this. I have an Instagram that I barely use called @McDonaldLyle. It's mostly dad jokes, pictures of my dogs, and just the occasional video of me poking at this industry when I get motivated. Probably the best place to find me is my Facebook group, which is just search for it as Body Recomposition. I never did rename it. I'm there. It's very active. I'm there regularly. And it's something I always like to point out that I tend to attract experts in a lot of diverse fields who, I mean, I learn from my group every single day. And if I don't know something, or I only know enough to be dangerous, which is the case on a lot of topics, people will ask questions about like stuff I've never heard of. And we will have 6 people who've dealt with it and 1 critical care nurse who's an expert. Like it boggles the mind for me, or my mind, just how much of the, we've got 5 top-notch physios. We've got a great OBGYN. It's just phenomenal. So my Body Recomposition Facebook group is where you'll find that. The only thing I want to say, it's as much about training as about, since let's face it, fat loss is a perennial goal, is something women need to know about their menstrual cycle, and then I'll let you go, is body weight swings. Because this can be very significant for women, and it can affect both tracking fat loss, but it can have a role, in the gym in terms of it may change mechanics a little bit. On average, what you see, typically body weight is lowest in the first week of the cycle. It typically will go up a little bit right before ovulation, and then we'll come back down. And if there's going to be an awful week, it will be week 4 when PMS occurs. So women who are tracking fat loss or weight loss or whatever, you can't compare week to week, because the rate of fat loss in any given week is easily overwhelmed by the water changes. So I'll see women go, oh, I started my diet and I lost 2 pounds down, and then the next week they're a pound up. I'm like, right, because you regained 3 pounds of water. and
Yeah,
then they'll
exactly.
lose, and then it'll spike by 2.5 kilos, and they'll go, oh my God. For women, they may have, just like they may have to only be able to add weight monthly, they're tracking for fat loss. You have to compare the same week to the same week. You can only compare week 1 to week, even if you're daily weighing, even if you're doing all the right stuff. What you're seeing is, all right, here's week 1, but here's week 2. Now the change may be the same, but the numbers, you're starting from a different place. And then week 3 may be here, and then week 4 maybe just stay off the scale in week 4. But in the weight room, women may feel, bloated. I mean, we're not talking, women vary again in how much their water weight changes from very little to very large amounts. But it's, coming to the gym, they may feel waterlogged or heavier. And if you're doing things that are body weight related, I mean, you've seen this as a guy, right? You're doing chins or dips for reps. And if your body weight's up like a kilo, you're done.
It feels different.
Right?
Yeah.
Like you will lose 5 reps. It's amazing how much of an impact that can have. And a woman may be seeing that on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
And having her anything body weight related may be significantly more difficult, especially if she's moving her body against gravity.
So I think the take home there is whether it's tracking your body weight or progress in the gym, you've got to compare apples to apples, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome.
And again, with the PCOS, it gets super random. If a woman loses her menstrual cycle, this does flatten out, but not for good reasons. Birth control, depending on the type, will frequently flatten this out and make it a little bit easier. But again, that's where you get into, like I said, dudes are just the same guy every week in, week out, day in, day out. And that just means that as a coach or an athlete, you have to be your own best scientist and be aware of these changes and track them. And once you figure them out, it'd be great to go, oh, I'm just going to, like, you can't just make a woman not have these particulars.
Exactly right.
You have to adapt the training and to a degree even the diet to her individual cycle. And when you do that, you tend to get much better results.
Awesome. Lyle, it's a pleasure, man. Thank you very much. Great talking to you again, and we'll see you soon.
Fantastic. Have a great day.